Welcome to No Man's an Island, a podcast powered by Men's Therapy Hub. I'm Chris Hemmings, and on this episode, I'm joined by Matt Pinkett. Matt is a teacher, author, and speaker specialising in masculinity, boys' mental health, and tackling misogyny in schools. He spent over a decade in the classroom and has become one of the UK's leading voices on how schools can better support boys without falling into the old boys will be boys script. He's the best-selling co-author of Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools, and the author of Boys Do Cry, which explores how we can improve boys' mental health and well-being in education. Hey, Matt.
Hey, how are you, man? You all right?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting to speak to you because you and I have been working in the same field and have had a lot of back and forth online, but we've never actually spoken in person.
No, we haven't. Yeah, it's weird. I'm honoured to. It's so nice to actually, speak to you in person.
Yeah, likewise. I've been a fan of your work for a while. So the first question on this podcast is always the same. You've been a teacher for longer than you've been doing this work with boys. So what happened? What was the moment that changed for you that thought, actually, you really needed to focus on this in a specific way?
Yeah, I, I I may have told this story before, but I can pinpoint the exact moment I decided that I needed to think about boys and how people were treating them. Do you want to hear the story?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I was an English teacher in a school of predominantly women teachers on my team. And there was this day when we were looking at a book of poetry. It was called Banned Poems for Boys. And there was this poem in there called The Minnow. And it was basically about this young lad who's on holiday, like a lad's holiday, Ayia Napa, somewhere like that. And he goes in the sea, and the sea's really cold, and it does to his appendage what cold sea would do to a man's appendage.
Yep.
Anyway, this girl that he fancies she appears on the shoreline and starts beckoning him out the water. And the whole poem was about his internal, like, kind of anxieties about the size of his appendage, basically, and not wanting to get out the water, and this girl to see that, he wasn't necessarily the man she thought he might be or whatever. And there was all these clumsy metaphors in there, and we were all having a good laugh about it, this poem. And then I remember I just said, look, to be honest, like, there might be boys, the amount of pornography boys are watching nowadays, some of them might have, like, this body insecurity that's exacerbated by their porn watching, about things like their penis size. And I just remember there was, like, this deathly silence, and then after about, it seemed like 30 seconds, but it was probably only 3 seconds, this lady just said to me, well, you would say that, you're a man, all you think about is sex. And then they all laughed and left the room, and I was just standing there sitting there thinking,
Wow.
I think boys deserve a little better than that, and so, yeah, and then I just started looking into bias and teachers' attitudes towards boys, parents' attitudes towards boys, and that's what's led me to where I am now.
Mm. And so this experience that you had left you feeling isolated.
I guess, yeah, certainly isolated in terms of, I mean, yeah, if that's how they're talking to me, how might they be talking to boys? And yeah, certainly I think it wasn't very. I'm a feminist, right? And as an English teacher, of course, there's lots of opportunities for us to discuss feminism. For a left-leaning profession like teaching, obviously the feminist agenda is a priority, I think. And so actually in 2016 or whenever it was, maybe just even before then, to be one of the only people writing about boys and kind of saying like, well, let's have a look at how boys are being treated. I think, I'm not going to say it was lonely, but there weren't many people doing it, I guess, at that time. And so I guess at times I did feel a little bit, particularly as a male in a predominantly female profession, I guess I did feel a little bit, I wouldn't say isolated, but outside of everybody else's way of thinking, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, as you well know, I've done a lot of work in schools myself, and from 2016, 2017 onwards, I understand the challenge of trying to convince a profession that understandably has been focusing on the challenges that girls face because they have been ignored for decades, let's say.
Yeah.
And so for you, you know, as you say, you are a feminist and you identify as such, and yet suddenly you have your eyes opened to, well, the boys need help. What did you start to see around you in your school, and then maybe as you started to look in school in wider school environments that were missing for boys? Targeted approaches or the ways that boys were being spoken about that actually weren't helpful.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the research picture backs this up as well. There's this tendency for adults to see boys as like less mature, as incapable of nuance, as kind of emotionally vapid, as naughty, as disruptive. And in the same way, people bring a lot of preconceptions as to how women and girls might behave or act. We do the same with boys, but certainly in the teaching profession, I think that what the research picture shows is that lots of teachers, not intentionally, it's often unconscious, because of, you know, stereotypes about gender. They bring this kind of deficit model of male achievement to how they think about boys and how they conceptualize boys as learners. Um, but that academic deficiency kind of intertwined with that is also, I think, a narrative about behavioral deficiencies, emotional deficiencies as well, which I think are quite problematic and often self-fulfilling.
Can you explain a little bit more for those who don't know what the deficit model is and the impact it can have?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, there was a really famous study back in 2004, Deborah Myhill and Susan Jones out of Exeter University. They went around the country and just asked teachers, are boys as capable as girls? Um, and the majority of teachers, when asked, will say, yes, of course, boys can perform in line with girls. However, what researchers also did during formal interviews was they were observing the kind of things that these teachers that said, yes, boys can do as well as girls. They were observing the way they spoke about them when they didn't necessarily know that they were being monitored for how they spoke about boys and girls. And yeah, almost every teacher in the study, even though they say, yes, boys can do as well as girls at school, they were far more likely to say things like, boys don't like reading, boys don't like writing, boys are disruptive, boys aren't mature, boys don't talk about their feelings, boys mess around, boys don't like boys have messy handwriting. So even when a teacher says, yeah, I think boys can do as well as girls at school, the reality of their discourse suggests otherwise, which the researchers concluded that is indicative of like an unconscious bias, a bias that positions boys as academically deficient in relation or in comparison to girls.
When you were training as a teacher, or even in the training now, is
Mm.
this the sort of thing that is picked up on? Is this, you know, we, as a therapist, we're taught a lot about unconscious bias in the therapy room, how to deal with race, religion, ethnicity, all these different things that we need to bring into our awareness. Is that
Yeah.
something that teachers go through in terms of gender?
No, I don't think so. I think men are often seen as the blueprint or as the default mode of being, and so we don't focus enough on these areas. Um, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that teachers will actually um, be punitive in the way that they mark a piece of work if they're aware that it's a boys' piece. Again, I don't think that's a conscious thing. It's an unconscious idea that boys perform less well. I remember when during COVID, when the government announced that schools and teachers would be giving Year 11 kids their GCSE grades. I
Yeah.
remember I put this tweet out and said, "Look, all the evidence suggests that if you're a boy, if you're black, if you're from a poorer socio-economic background, or if you know, you speak English as an additional language, your teachers will be biased in the grades they award you. So if the government are going to make us do this, then we need some sort of mandatory anti-bias protection training." And the response I got from Twitter was so negative. People absolutely refusing to accept that the teaching profession, for example, would ever be biased. That it was all underpinned by this kind of belief that teaching being a noble profession,
You're all too good for that.
yeah, somehow makes teachers kind of impervious to all the natural kind of stereotypes and bias that the rest of the general population succumb to and are susceptible to, simply because they're human. Stereotyping and bias is actually quite a natural human function. It's a survival function. But the only problem comes is when we refuse to admit that an unconscious bias we might have could affect someone negatively. And if we refuse to accept that, then I think we're letting a lot of people down. Interestingly, when you look at the attainment gap, as I believe it, both at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, if you look at the gender gap, then the year in which teachers had to assign grades was when the gaps between boys and girls was its widest. You know,
so there was at least some evidence to back up what you were saying. Yeah. And I guess when that happens, I presume there's a part of you that feels vindicated, but a part of you that feels equally sad to be vindicated.
Yeah, of course. And then you look at let's say we close the gap and all of a sudden boys start doing better than girls in school. Well, then we've got another gap to address. I think it's a difficult one. You're never in a school setting going to get boys and girls, poor children, rich children, white children, black children, EAL children, native. You're never going to get every cohort within a school all scoring equally on tests. It's an impossibility. So for me now, I think as my work moves forward, I'm less concerned with the academic disparities, and more concerned with, social injustices or gaps. I'm quite aware about things like mental health, the way that black boys are spoken about, misogyny, punitive kind of behavioural sanctions that affect boys disproportionately, that sort of thing. But I don't want to sound like a male rights activist. I'm definitely not that.
No, and the fact that you even have to protest that is something that we've spoken about on this podcast. This is, we're in the early throes of this podcast, and it's come up multiple times that as men, when we are talking about these things, we have to make it very clear that we are still supporting women. And that's actually the question I was going to ask you next, was about misogyny, because you are quite focused on misogyny in schools. And I got two questions for you on this. The first one is, right now there seems to be at least an upswell of fear about misogyny in school.
Yeah.
In the time that you've been a teacher and done this work, do you see that there has been an increase in misogyny in schools?
Intuitively, I would say yes. I'm also always aware of the fact that the more I write about misogyny, the more I read and research about it, the more hypersensitive I am to hearing it or seeing it. I probably, I would argue, am more aware of it than most people, simply because it's the nature of a lot of the work I do.
Most men, for sure.
Sorry?
Most men, for
Most
sure.
men. Oh yeah. That's an important thing to say. Yeah, you're right there. I also think that we're limping very slowly towards greater female empowerment. So people often ask me the question, has there been an increase in misogyny, or are we just more aware of it now? And I don't really know the answer, to be honest. I certainly think there's a lot more brazen misogyny. I think we went through a period where it was something maybe we didn't speak about out loud. I certainly know, anecdotally speaking to teachers, certainly women teachers that I speak to are shocked by just how kind of out there it is in terms of boys speaking out loud about it, and it's now almost become a part of the costume of masculinity. But I mean, like the outward facing costume, like, it's the jumper or the tie, rather than whereas before it might have been the underpants that no one could see. Now I think it's something that men are wearing more openly. But whether it's increased or not, I think is quite difficult to tell. Certainly, what we can't deny is that there is a greater increase of online misogyny, through TikTok and other social media sites,
How do you counter that in school? How do you counter that pervasive narrative that young boys are being fed? And again, I don't want to demonize the quote manosphere in totality, because some of it is healthy, some of it is positive, some of it is telling boys to look after themselves, but some of it is sprinkled with misogynistic language.
Yeah. I think you've got to connect to boys, isn't when we look at, if we look at, say, incels, okay, so involuntary celibates, a group of men who believe that they are biologically deficient in terms of physical attractiveness, and as a result they will not be able to form romantic or sexual relationships with women. Incels, they have much higher rates of depression, much higher rates of anxiety, much higher rates of suicidal ideation than the general population. They are more likely to say that they were bullied at school. And so I think for young men who are at risk of being radicalized into this extreme misogyny by incel groups and stuff like that, I think what we've really got to do is find ways of connecting with boys, so that when they do face, romantic rejection or romantic failure or sexual embarrassment or humiliation, whatever it is, rather than, going home and being suckered in, or taken in by this misogynistic content, rather than going to that space, they will come to us. So I think we really need to focus on connecting with boys. And I think that begins by not demonizing them for a start. I think we need to be very direct with boys. If you take sexual harassment, for example, so many of the boys that I speak to, the things that they think are banter or flirting are actually sexual harassment. But nobody's ever just sat them down and said, right, just so you know, this is what sexual harassment is. So once they know, for example, what sexual harassment is, they can make the active choice not to sexually harass people, because now they know what it is. They didn't realize before. And then what that means is then all of a sudden, when people, when boys are reading the headlines about increases in male violence against women and girls or increases in sexual harassment, they can rest assured that they are not part of that problem. They could actually be a solution to it rather than part of the problem. So I think actually just speaking to boys, so often we just don't do that. We think that boys are incapable of emotional nuance. And do you know what? Maybe some of them are, because that's what gender can do to men. You probably know that more than anyone, that some men find it really difficult to talk. But we can only get men to talk if we start to listen to them and start just talking with them, I think there are other problems. I think the way we stigmatize the watching of pornography is quite problematic. I mean, I can't say too much, as I'm still, up until the end of this academic year, I'm still a teacher. But some of the way that people in our field, in the field of gender and gender studies and or whatever you want to call it, gender politics, masculinity, so many men and women are vehemently anti-pornography. I've always found this a little bit Victorian. Some of the things that we might see in pornography are terrible. Exploitation of women, deep fakes, all that horrible stuff. But there are
unrealistic.
And
unrealistic views and visions of human bodies.
Exactly. But there are ethical sites and there are ways to watch pornography responsibly. But I think as a society, certainly as adults, what we tend to do is we talk about pornography as this filthy, disgusting thing, totally ignoring the fact that for thousands and thousands of years, human beings have been aroused by sex and seeing sex. And I think that if all we do is we talk about young boys who are engaging in pornography, and I think in this country, the average age for a boy to first watch pornography is 11 years old in this country. If all we do is make boys feel like dirty or sexually deviant for having watched it, I think we put up a real barrier there, and it makes it very difficult for them to ask questions about that content that they might have seen that they might find upsetting or distressing or make them anxious. So, it's not just we need to talk to boys. I think we also need to think about what we're talking about and how we're talking about it sometimes.
The big point that you made there is we have to find a way to connect with boys. And I think one of the big frustrations for me and the work I've been doing for a long time in schools trying to work with boys is I always felt like Empath was trying to combat the narrative the boys had heard that they were toxic, problematic, whatever it might be, the language. You understand that helping boys will also help girls. I think one of the problems we have is a lot of the messaging is we need to help boys specifically so that we help girls. That the boys are the boys are secondary in their own needs for support. So we need to help boys because if we do, then the girls will be okay.
Yeah.
How do you combat all of that? Like, what message do you take in when you go to schools or when you speak to parents or teachers around the country? What are you saying to them about what needs to change in terms of the approach we have to boys and how we actually, call them in rather than calling them out and pushing them away?
Yeah. I mean, three things I'd say off the back of that. You've made me think about, I'm often in a lot of trouble because I still use this phrase toxic masculinity. And yeah, people don't like me using it. People hate me using it. I'm always very upfront with the boys. So today I was with some boys and I said to them, look, lads, I always use this phrase and I get a lot of stick for it. Their first question is always, why? And I say, well, basically people think that when I say the phrase toxic masculinity, what I'm suggesting is that simply by virtue of being masculine or a boy or a man, you're automatically noxious or harmful in some way. They're like, okay. I say, in actual fact, I love men. A bit of internalized homophobia means that some of them laugh when I say I love men. But then, then I explain why I still use the phrase toxic masculinity. I say there are certain behaviours in society, certain things that are going on that I think are really harmful. Boys are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than girls, right? That's a masculine behaviour. It's a harmful one. It's tragic that men and boys are taking their lives because they feel that they can't openly be vulnerable or seek support when they're in times of need. You look at street violence, gang violence, boys are more likely to be the victims of those things. They're also more likely to be the perpetrators of those. There's all sorts of reasons. And I actually find that when you actually talk to the boys, all right, and I say to them, look, I don't think men are toxic. I think that most men are good men, but I like the phrase for me because it gives me a benchmark to measure myself against. And I think that a lot of the critics of me using that phrase are actually doing boys a disservice. They're talking about boys as if they're these empty vessels that just soak up every message that they're ever taught, as if me going toxic masculinity makes them automatically feel all sad and toxic. If only it was that easy, my job as a teacher and the results I'd get every year would be through the roof. The fact is, boys are very capable of emotional nuance. They're very they're very thoughtful and they're willing to discuss these things and wrestle with the ideas, and they can see the good in the phrase and they can also see the bad, and I do think there is room for nuance. And the fact that so much of what we do in gender, and I think again this is relevant to getting boys and connecting with boys, this idea that everybody has to be a saint, and you have to be perfect and to have got it right first time. I think that puts so many boys off, and men. I'm always very upfront with the boys. The way I've treated women over the years has been deplorable. I think of homophobic comments and jokes that I used to say, violence as a kid, And I think when we're honest about that, with boys, they can see, okay, well, there's somebody up here saying this, and they're not perfect, but they're trying to get better, and maybe I can too. Yeah.
I like this because this gives me a live opportunity to disagree with you,
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
but also to understand your perspective, because I don't use the term toxic masculinity. It's why I gave the faux as you said it, because research there's research that shows that around the world, roughly, and it's different in every part of the world, but roughly about 80% of men worldwide identify as masculine.
Yeah.
So while I understand the etymology and the usage of the term toxic masculinity, for men who identify as masculine to then be told, or at least then the perception of being told, that a part of them that they identify as is toxic, can be disconnecting from themselves. And actually what it does potentially is creates a negative relationship to their masculinity. Now, here's the caveat to that, because I know that what people are saying is not that all of masculinity is toxic. I know that what is being said is that there are aspects of what is perceived to be masculinity that are toxic. But that's where I would say, actually, and it's not as pithy, actually, what we're talking about are toxic behaviors associated with rigid male expectations. But that
You're
has
right,
been,
that's not as pithy.
it's not as pithy, right? Exactly. It's toxic behaviors associated with rigid male expectations.
Yeah.
And it's not the masculinity that's toxic. It is the rigidity of the pressures that we put on boys. So I do understand why you use it. And actually, in the masculinity workshop that Empath does, we do talk about the traits associated with toxic masculinity. So we do like shout out some of the traits that you would associate with toxic masculinity. And actually, when you boil them down, I've never done one, and I don't know if the lads have because I haven't checked, where 100%, and this is what the workshop tries to show, 100% of the behaviors associated with the idea of toxic masculinity is about dominance. It's about male dominance, and it is about this rigid idea that as a man, I have to prove all the time that I am the best, that I am superior, and I will climb over my mates, and I'll climb over women, and I will literally fight my way to the top if I have to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do get it. And like I said, I mean, in my first book, Mark and I, my co-author, we said, get rid of the term. It's harmful. It's not a great term. In my second book, I said the exact opposite. In my third or fourth, I might change again. I do.
Well, you can use rigid expectation. You can use my pithy one if you want.
Yeah, rigid. Yeah, I mean, I do see the problem.
It's really memorable, right?
Yeah, I tried to gloss over that. Yeah, I do see the problem with the terminology. I think it's widely used. I do try, and I'm quite self-reflective. I often ask the question, I think when I first started hearing the term, I think I would become quite defensive, quite angry. But now I'm in a space where I'm perfectly happy with the term. And sometimes I just ask myself the question, what is it about me? What have I gone through this past 6 or 7 years since I first heard the term and published a book in which I said it was disgusting, we shouldn't be using it? What's happened over the 6 or 7 years to get me to a place where I'm now comfortable with it? And what I would say with that is education. All right, learning and listening to women, which I never did before, learning from women, and about the female experience, also reflecting and accepting that some of my own behavior has been unacceptable. I think before I was always so defensive against that. But since accepting that where, my own flaws and where I've let myself and women down, for example, and listening to women, I'm now in a space where I'm actually okay with the term, and I don't see it as an affront to my own masculinity. I'm quite proud of my masculinity. I think I present as quite a masculine man, whatever that means. And I see the paradoxes in that, that certainly in many ways I'm trying to break down certain expectations or of masculinity, but at other times I embrace them. And again, I'm kind of okay with that. I kind of think of masculinity. I've already used the analogy before as like a wardrobe, and there are certain items of clothing that just don't look good anywhere. All right, wherever you wear them. But there are other items of clothing that work well depending on the dress code of the place that you're in. And I'm just trying to be a savvy dresser, and not offend anybody with my outfit.
That is a conversation that we could probably do an entire podcast on.
Yeah.
What I will say is I love that you've gone from using it to not using it. Sorry, from not using it to using it. I've gone from happily using it to not using it.
Yeah.
And I think that shows there isn't a right or wrong answer when it comes to topics on gender. Listeners will already know, because I've told the story of doing a talk in a school and then teachers complaining because 100% of the staff didn't agree with me. And it's like, what? That's not ever going to happen when you're having conversations around gender. And you and I, who are specifically pulling in an almost identical direction, disagree on something. And that's great, because
Yeah,
actually what that means is there is diversity of thought out there. And actually, in a sense, what your whole work has been about is to challenge the orthodoxy of boys are just this way and they always have been and they always will be.
yeah. I wonder what a boy would say listening to our conversation the past 10 minutes. I'd be, 16-year-old lad. I wonder what he'd make of it.
Yeah.
You'd hope it would be a positive, like you say, both two blokes just pulling in the same direction, but being reflective about the language we're using and stuff. That's something that not a lot of men, well, that not all men can do very well. I think is think about the words and the language that they're using.
And disagree respectfully.
Without punching each other.
You bastard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested, partly because of your accent,
Yeah.
and partly because of what I've seen you speak about. And you just said there also, you just said that in your life you've done deplorable things to people, and I presume to yourself as well. So what was your formational experiences like as a young man, like growing up in some part of East London, I'm guessing?
Yeah, I actually grew up in Medway in Kent, and then I now actually live in Surrey, but
Okay.
I grew up when all the Guy Ritchie films came out and stuff, and so we were all speaking like the gangsters we saw in those, and then all of a sudden that Cockney sort of twang, which was Mockney at one point,
right,
is now just how I speak. I don't know how I'd actually speak. I was born in Devon as well, so I'm all over.
Oh, right. Okay.
But, talking about deplorable things, I think, I think violence and being intimidating. I think casual homophobia. I think objectifying women. I think in recent years I've used my poor mental health as an excuse for mistreating people that I love. And not just being too selfish, really, and not being selfless, and I think I've lost a lot as a result of that, and it does mean now I'm sitting here at 40 years old and with a lot of regret in my life. And that's what I always say to boys, about tackling misogyny and stuff, and the homophobia and the violence and the glorification of violence. I said, you don't want to be 41 years old, lads, and looking back with regret and with shame and with guilt. You don't want to be doing that, so it's I passionately believe that tackling misogyny, yes, it's great for girls, but it is really good for boys too, and they deserve it. You know, they deserve a life without bitterness, resentment, guilt, shame. Um, mm.
And that's how you feel about, and to use your wardrobe analogy, the violence, the misogyny, the homophobia, they were staples in the wardrobe, right? They were that was an outfit you wore most days when you were around other lads.
Well, no, I mean, when I say like the homophobia, I was never, would never bully or be violent to someone who was gay. In fact, somebody got in touch fairly recently to say that they always remember me from school because I was the only person that would stick up for them when people were homophobic. But in conversations, just as a kid, like, oh, those trainers are gay, and that language thing, in terms of the violence, I wasn't in gangs or anything like that, but certainly when I was very young, scrapping, and I was tall for my age, and we lived in Kent, growing up in Kent in the 90s, and my mum married an Indian man. And that meant we got a lot of racist abuse directed at us. My mum, walking down the street, people, spitting in her face and stuff. And,
Wow.
so at school, as somebody that was a lot bigger than the other lads, I don't know, I'd be hearing racism, and I thought that because I had an Indian stepfather that maybe it was my responsibility to tackle racism when the other boys were being racist to other kids, and unfortunately it looked like me lamping them rather than actually sitting down and talking it calmly through with them, and educated. But when you're 12, 10, 9, whatever years old, you don't do that. I think I think alcohol as well, I think that's quite, like drinking culture at university, and that hasn't done me a lot of favors either. So, it's, um, I do spend a lot of time thinking about that. I guess it's almost like that imposter thing, right? Like, here I am doing this work, and at times I feel like a fraud, So I want to be very honest about the fact that, I've never been a saint. I'm trying to be one now,
It's hard work, though, isn't it?
Of course, and you make mistakes, don't you? You make mistakes, and I guess when I make mistakes, they just eat me up a little bit,
Where does that come from? Because I've seen you online, and you are extreme for a teacher. Also, you're extremely honest about your failings, and you're also very honest, as you just were a moment ago, about the challenges you have with your mental health, or at the times that they're happening. So
Yeah.
where do you find that courage to do that? And I guess I'm also curious to know, do you ever take a step back and think maybe you're being overly critical of yourself, like a bit harsh on yourself?
It's a good point. Yeah. No, I never think I'm being too harsh on myself. There are times when I wonder, am I possibly being too harsh on myself? But generally, the answer I always come up with is no. I think the mental health thing's an interesting one. I mean, I went for so many years without getting medicated for it. And then back in 2017, 18, I saw something that really affected me. You know, without going into too much detail, I saw somebody have a seizure. And I didn't deal well with that. I had a mental breakdown. I was off work for about 4 weeks. And I went on the pills then, but then I came off them again. And then I had a breakup fairly recently, and I was not in a good place. And now I'm on the meds. I am a lot more measured. But But of course, being on the meds and ideally being sober means that you do get clarity and lucidity. And so perhaps I have a tendency to overthink. It's always a battle between doing the wrong thing that will give me mental ease and help me to forget some of those things I want to forget, but also doing the right thing for my physical health, my mental health, and my family and my daughter. And the payoff or of that, of things like sobriety and taking the meds, is that unfortunately you do get a little, or fortunately you get a little bit more clarity, and sometimes you linger on those unpleasant experiences. But hey, at least I'll live longer, and hopefully I can be a dad for longer. So, certainly the way I was carrying on wouldn't have necessarily ended that way, so.
And is that a daily fight for you to not slip back into old habits?
Yeah. Every waking moment is a bit of a battle. Yes. And like, yeah, it's just an exhausting conversation with myself quite a lot of the time. Uh that gets, I'm in my own head all of the time. But again, that does have its benefits. I think there are situations where that maybe pays off for me. Maybe there are times where I've been a little more empathetic than somebody else, or more empathetic than I would have been in a past life. You know, I think it reminds me of this. People often tell me I'm too sensitive. And I don't like the way we stigmatize sensitivity. I think that, yeah, okay, that it's not great being sensitive and constantly thinking, beating yourself up about stuff, but also, I guess, I'm more sensitive, if that's what being sensitive is, to love, to happiness, to joy when it comes. So, but yeah, in answer to your question, it's a pretty constant kind of internal dialogue with myself, about making the right decision. And you can never really be complacent with it,
And you've been working in schools for a decade now, and you've said that you're about to end at the end of this academic year. And we'll come on to that in a second, because I'm curious to know what the next step is for you. But I think sometimes we forget that teachers are also humans dealing with the same shit that all the other humans deal with. And then also dealing with the shit of 20 odd kids in front of you for an hour at a time. How do you go about the separation of kind of the church and state of, as a teacher, a lot of teachers like the fact that I can go into a school and be honest about my drug taking and my mental health challenges and my bisexuality or whatever it might be, because I won't see those kids again.
Yeah.
So for you, what is it like for you when you're really struggling and you're really down and you're going through a breakup, but you've got to go to work on Monday and you've got to sit in a classroom of kids and not just be a complete car crash?
Yeah. I struggle, in all honesty. Yeah, I really struggle. And it's part of the reason I'm leaving now. I'm now at a place where there are things that I need to talk about. There are things that I feel morally obligated or morally obliged to talk about and to discuss, to think about, to speak about, that I simply can't because of my role as a teacher. And also, I think that mental health wise, I'm not strong. I'm no longer strong enough to be a teacher. I think that the job is a difficult one. And it's one that I've no longer got the strength to do anymore, So, I'm going to dig in deep and give the kids that I still teach the best deal I can give them. But in answer to your question, there's simply things that you just can't say. And professionally, that's quite frustrating. You know, some of the media stuff I've been asked to do, having to turn it down because, you know, you don't want kids knowing everything about you. But also at the same point, I guess part of certainly what people say they like about me and my shtick and my writing and is that I'm quite blunt and direct and quite honest. And so again, that's getting a kind of an exhausting tightrope to walk along, you know.
Mm.
And so it's best I jump off before I fall off, you know.
And that in itself is an act of courage and bravery to recognize your own um, ceiling, in a sense. And I wonder if I could take you back to your like 15-year-old self and say, one day you are going to, for the good of your own mental health, step down from a job that you have learned so much from and loved and been a part of, and that has formed you so much, because you wouldn't be doing this work with men and boys if you hadn't been a teacher.
Yeah,
Maybe you
yeah.
would, but in a different way. Do you think that that would be something that you would believe that you'd be capable of doing? Because what you're doing goes almost directly against the boy code, the kind of the man code of don't show
Stoicism.
weakness. Yeah.
Yeah. Probably not, you know. Probably not. Uh but it's where I am now, you know. But yeah, certainly at 15 years old, um, I don't think it would have been beyond the realms of, you know, I wouldn't have been able to not fathom it. You know, I've always been sensitive. Even as a 15-year-old, I would have thought, you know, if someone said, "Oh, one day you're gonna have to leave your job, or one day you're gonna leave your job to protect your mental health," um, I probably would have thought, okay, possibly. Um, but certainly I'd be skeptical of that idea. You know, I'd have mixed feelings about it. But right now, I think it's the best thing. You know, there's a lot of great teachers out there, and um, I'm just tired. I'm just so tired. You know. So yeah.
Have you ever been to therapy?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not. You know. Yeah. I'm very skeptical.
You're allowed to be skeptical here, Matt. It's okay.
Yeah,
This is
you know, the way things I've said to therapists in the past is like, oh, did Ed Sheeran write that? Or like, just because you've seen it on a poster with, with a sunset on it doesn't mean it's not true. Like, I'm very skeptical of those kind of therapy platitudes and stuff, you know. Um, you can't love somebody else until you love yourself. I'm like, there's no objective truth to that. Like, where's the book that says, what if I don't love myself, but loving other people helps me to better love myself? Like, you know, I sometimes think that some therapists I've met, it just seems like they're reading out of like a Instagram therapy post book, you know, and just saying all the things that you hear like people from school post on Facebook or MSN Messenger status updates, you know.
showing your age now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I am skeptical. I'm also skint, you know, like, it's, I do think as a society, um, certainly I'm looking to do some work into making therapy or setting up some sort of charity or fund where I can give people in need the money that they need to go to therapy. Um, you know, I've tried all the free kind of texting online stuff, CBT. That doesn't work for me. Now, if it works for other people, brilliant. But I do think there's something that needs to be done to make it more affordable for people. Um, you know.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. And actually, if you do ever think about setting that up, then please do let me know,
Yeah,
because
man. Let's do it.
men's
You know.
men's therapy hub would love to be a part of that. Because what I say to a lot of people is that the therapy profession is really shit at marketing itself, because every year there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are available for, like, I did 2 years for 20 quid a session. right? Low cost, affordable therapy,
That's
because I
amazing.
was training, and that's available right now, but people don't know about it. And I charge 85 quid for an hour for a session, but I also have an unemployment rate, which I have 2 slots available, unemployed students or apprentices for 50 quid, right?
Yeah.
And I fully understand that that cost is a factor, but I think the frustrating thing for me is what you've just articulated there is you actually made it a couple of times, and we lost, like, our profession lost you because the quality of the therapy doesn't sound like it was very good, but also, and the research suggests this, it sounds like you didn't really feel much of an affinity with your therapist.
Yeah, yeah, that might be true. Yeah. Um,
Like, what
yeah.
would you have needed to actually be kept in and stay longer, aside from more cash?
I think I could never play the long game. I think therapy needs to be an ongoing thing, and I think I often like to see practical outcomes. I want to feel like I'm getting better. Whereas I think firstly, I think a lot of my therapy that I've done was kind of performative. It was just me. It was a way I could signpost to family members or girlfriends, look, I'm doing the work. Whereas actually, maybe when I was in there, because of my cynicism, I wasn't really doing the work. Um, so I think, in answer to your question, what would I have needed? Um, I needed to see the long game, but again, the long game costs money. And for me now, as you know, I don't live with my daughter, and so what happens is I have to pay my own rent, but also obviously, you pay. I want to, and I choose to pay certain sum of money for my daughter, um, um, on top of what I spend when I see her. There's bills and everything else. Um, when you're with someone, it's like everything gets halved. When you're not with someone, it's like everything gets doubled. So I just can't really legitimately afford to pay for therapy long term, because that's money that my daughter's not getting, or
Mm.
that's a rent that ain't getting paid. Or um
Yeah,
but yeah.
I get that, and I really do understand the
Mm.
financial barrier. Um, you are here, you're talking openly about your troubles. You stand on stages and you talk openly about your troubles. Um, do you find that therapeutic? And as a follow on, like, where do you go for therapeutic relief now that maybe you didn't? Because you're not self medicating with substances. You're not slipping into old patterns to avoid your experiences. You're actually actively engaging with them now. So
Yeah.
where do you go to seek that comfort?
Well, actually, the place I would go would be the pub, right? It would be the pub. And after a few drinks, I can loosen up and talk and have the amount of beautiful, beautiful friendships I've cultivated in drinking establishments is amazing. But sadly, that drink is not good for me. And as a result of that, I then lose those connections and that feeling of being able to talk. I'm quite socially quite awkward, without medication, be it self-medication or whatever. I find it very difficult to talk to people. When I'm off the booze, all people do, and it does my head in. People, Matt, you don't drink so much or whatever. It's like, okay. And then as soon as I meet them in a social situation, they go, "You're being grumpy. You're quiet. You're grumpy. You're quiet." I'm not grumpy. I am just quiet. This is how I am. Right.
I'm sober.
My default setting is I find it difficult to talk to people. I don't enjoy not being able to talk. Like, I'm just sitting inside hating myself, trying to think of something interesting to say, but I just can't. I'm not very good at it. Um, but I do find the work therapeutic, standing up on a stage, talking to you now and talking about these things. It does give me, it's the only thing that gives me a buzz that other things could. So So I enjoy the work, and that's another reason I need to pursue it and leave teaching and pursue the writing and the speaking stuff, because it's something I do really, really enjoy, and there's not much, apart from my time with my daughter, there's not much I do enjoy. And so it's really important that if I find something I enjoy, I I latch onto it and, bleed it dry for all I can, for as long as I can. Um, because yeah, it gives me that buzz, that little adrenaline. And it's fun.
Is that what gives you the courage to, if you're not somebody that is naturally inclined to speaking up and talking openly, actually, is that what gives you the courage to do it? That when you do it, you realize actually this feels good.
Yeah, I do think also, it's not all noble either. Sometimes it's space. Like, I like attention, I'm often quite insecure. So actually standing on stage and having people, listening to you, laughing along with you, taking them on a journey, whether it be through an anecdote or a story, or even a piece of education, and having them come up after and say, thanks for that, I didn't know that, or you've made me think about this differently, on a very crass kind of baser level, it just feels good, doesn't it, to have people say, I like what you said today, or I think you're a good speaker, or whatever. So there is that, of course, but I guess on a deeper level, I do think that I gave a talk fairly recently, and 5 minutes after the talk, a girl disclosed that her father was raping her. And it was only after seeing my talk that she felt that she could stand up and say to a teacher that that's what's been happening. Now, that's a very extreme example. It's a very sad example, but, that's powerful work, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I do think that this misogyny work and this masculinity work is, I think right now, at the moment, it's where I'm having the most positive impact on the world. Probably more so than my teaching.
I'm going to let you go because we're trying not to drag this out Joe Rogan style for like 9 hours. Um, Couple of questions.
Yep.
You are moving out of the teaching profession and you are about to embark upon doing this professionally long term. And like, yes, I'm so glad that you are doing that because your voice has been so powerful for so long in this space, and you still have so much to say very clearly from this brilliant conversation. What is your hope? What is your biggest hope? Because I think we can focus so much on where are the boys fucking up, right? But
Yeah.
what's your biggest hope for? Are we at Gen A now in schools? Generation Alpha? I lose
Yeah.
track. It's the thing with the crossover from Gen Z and Gen A. But for this next generation of boys who are currently in school, what do you see in them that maybe isn't being spoken about, that we aren't saying, do you know what? The boys are all right because of X. What is that?
Yeah. I think there are, every day when I'm going into schools, I'm seeing boys, laddie, blokey boys come up to me and say, thanks for that. Like, we needed to hear that. So I guess what I would hope is that one day boys, even typically masculine laddie boys, can be unashamedly vulnerable, can be unashamedly vocal in their advocation, in the way they advocate for women and support women. I'd like to see bisexual, LGBT, gay boys be proud and out there and have, heterosexual allies. And you do see it, it is happening. I do think that a lot of the narrative about masculinity is missing, is the good boys. And then there are so many, um, and, again, when you talk to boys, they can be very vulnerable. They are capable of emotional, nuanced thought, and I just want them to become a little less ashamed of that, and be more openly vocal, and supportive of one another and supportive of women. That's what I'd really like.
And just to reflect on my own experiences, the thing that kept me going was exactly what you just spoke about there. Like some really harrowing disclosures like that girl disclosed to you, which is a really important step in her life, or those boys who at the start of the talk are dicking around and trying not to listen, and then they come up to you at the end and they go like, yes sir, and they
Yeah,
like give you a little
you
knuckles and
see
like,
them change, don't you?
yeah.
They come up with so much hostility or either hostility or yeah, like you say, like dicking around. Um, and then, when you talk to them, you can see them like come around to your way of thinking or certainly they want to at least listen, and that's a step forward. So yeah, I recognize that experience that you just said.
And those moments are the energy, right? Because when you
Yeah.
have that, it's like, okay, I can go to the next one and do that work, and that's what keeps coming up in this podcast is this idea of let's stop thinking of success here as changing the entire world, but if we can change one lad's mind, like if one person listens to this podcast and changes their mind about one thing, then you and I have done a good job here today, right? This is not going to change the world.
Yeah.
Um, however, and regular listeners will know I love a bad segue, and this is a really bad one. I am going to give you a chance to change the whole world now, because the final question is a hypothetical question, right? If I give you the keys to the vault, you have unlimited funds to make one social change that is going to help in this space in some way. What would you do with that money? Where do you think the biggest change socially would happen?
What a question. What a question. Um, are you talking specifically the area of gender? Yeah, masculinity.
Not necessarily. If you think there's another area that would
I mean, my
benefit.
first thing I think is something needs to be done about religious intolerance, and that in the light of what's happened in Australia yesterday, I think I think I, a lot of that is masculinity, though.
It's
You
usually
saw,
male shooters, isn't it?
yeah, I'd there's something needs to be done about that in schools of getting and exposing children to experiences and beliefs that are different from their own. I think that it's only when we listen to one another that we can begin to change. I asked the question earlier, what was it about me that means 6 years ago or 7 years ago I didn't like the term toxic masculinity, but now I'm okay with it. And I do think it has been questioning myself and learning from the women in my life and actually seeking out advice and reflections and saying to people, give it to me straight. I want to understand. And certainly, yeah, for young people, and I do think it's intersectional with masculinity. Something desperately needs to be done about ensuring that young people are exposed to different cultures just from a young age. I'm not smart enough to figure out how to do that, but that would be great, wouldn't it?
To create spaces where you can have dialogue with people with different thought processes, different backgrounds, different race, religion, disability, sexuality, all of that, and have it like moderated, basically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I would go as far to say, if you could formalize that sort of thing, somehow. Um, yeah, I
It's a good
think
idea.
yeah, I think it'd
I
be
like it.
great. You
Yeah, I
know,
like it.
I'm not a religious education teacher, but often it's a lesson that's children like, oh, it's pointless, it's pointless. I can't think of anything more relevant. Learning about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikh, I can't think of anything more relevant in today's multicultural society. Maybe it's the approach with which we take it. Maybe the end aim shouldn't be just the acquisition of facts, but maybe if we worded the way we do it as the end goal isn't just to know lots about Islam or Christianity. The end goal is is understanding and a reduction in fear and scaremongering.
To move away from maybe just religious studies and do like religion and culture studies.
Yeah.
To learn about different cultures. Great idea. I love it. It's in the files now with all the others. I've had some great ones so far. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for spending your time with us. I really appreciate the work that you do. I've admired it for so long. I'm so happy to hear. Well, I'm not happy to hear that you're leaving teaching because you're not okay, but I'm happy to hear that you are going to be going all in on helping young boys, because I know how powerful the work you do can be. I know that you inspire so many. I know that there will always be the boy sitting in every room that you're in speaking who isn't telling you just how powerful the impact you're having on him will be. And that's what I tell all of the facilitators at Empath when they join, is don't forget about the boys who aren't telling you, who in 3-4 years from now will be emanating the message that you brought. So it's such a powerful message, Matt, and I'm really grateful that you were here today.
Brilliant.
And thank you for your time, and I'll speak to you again in the future.
Yeah, we need to think about this idea, don't we, about getting therapy out there to or some sort of charity or fund. Let's talk about it.
Let's chat about it. I love it. I'm always up for that. All right. Cool. Cheers, Matt.
All right. Take care, mate.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to No Man's an Island. If you enjoyed this, please share, like, and subscribe so more people can join in the conversation. This podcast is powered by Men's Therapy Hub, where you'll find more resources, support, and a directory of male therapists for male clients. Don't forget to follow our Instagram and TikTok at Men's Therapy Hub. The music is by the Swedish artist Reindeer, spelled Raindear. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.